I'd like to begin this morning by asking a couple of hypothetical questions. Now, please don't answer aloud. Just think to yourself how you would answer this question. First, is there any difference between sharing a glass of alcohol with a family member at a meal and drinking alcohol at a fraternity party? Is there any difference between those two situations? Second question. Is there any difference between listening to secular music on your iPod or on the radio or wherever and attending a secular music concert? Any difference between those two situations? While you're thinking about that, take your Bible and turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. There's a Bible underneath your seat or in the rack in front of you if you'd like to borrow one. That's page 811 in those Bibles, 1 Corinthians 10. Now we're going through a series on the book of 1 Corinthians, and the goal of the book of 1 Corinthians and of our series is to help us to think, love, and live like Christ. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul takes the mind of Christ and applies it to a number of very practical situations and helps walk us through what it would look like to think like Jesus in those situations. Now, one of the situations that he addresses is meat sacrificed to idols, and he spends a lot of time on it in 1 Corinthians. He talks about it in chapters 8, 9, and 10. Now, that's one of the issues that doesn't have immediate practical ramifications for us today, but the great thing about God and his word is that the Spirit takes things which may have originally been meant for Israel or for the earliest Christians and uses them in our lives because God had us in mind when he was writing them as well as the original audience. And the great thing about meat sacrificed to idols is not that specific issue, but that issue represents a broader category of issues which are very, very relevant to our lives. And these are the amoral issues of life. What I mean by amoral issues are the things that are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. So we're not talking about Bible reading and prayer, which are inherently good, nor are we talking about, say, sexual immorality or stealing, which are inherently evil. We're talking about all the stuff that falls in between in the sort of gray areas of life. Things like social drinking, or secular music, or dancing, or tattoos, or vegetarianism, or whatever it might be, that God has not specifically pronounced either good or bad through his word. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, we heard a sermon from Tom Olson about these amoral issues. And in that case, we were talking about the consideration of a weaker brother. And he gave the example of a youth worker who had chosen not to socially drink alcohol, lest he cause any of the youth he was working with to stumble. That's exactly what 1 Corinthians 8 is talking about. It's talking about amoral issues in relation to weaker brothers and sisters in Christ. We also had another sermon on amoral issues, the things that are neither inherently positive nor negative, in 1 Corinthians 9. And there Paul was telling us that we are to become all things to all people so that we might win some to Christ. And I gave you the example of inviting your non-Christian neighbor over for dinner and having that non-Christian neighbor bring a bottle of wine as a hostess gift. And the encouragement to us was, all other things taken into account, I'm not talking about alcoholism, getting drunk and underage and all of that stuff, but all other things taken into account, if it would smooth the way for you to be able to build a relationship with your non-Christian friend, then it would be helpful to partake of that bottle of wine and to share it with that person. And that's 1 Corinthians 9. Now we come to 1 Corinthians 10. And there's a different issue that Paul is addressing in relation to these amoral areas of life. And the question he's addressing in 1 Corinthians 10 is, does context matter? See, in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul is talking about not eating meat sacrificed to idols in the privacy of your own home. He's talking about the Corinthians who were going to pagan festivals and celebrations, and they are partaking of meat that had been sacrificed to idols. And the question is does the context in which we participate in these things matter? Well, in order to answer that question, let's start where Paul starts, and that's in verse 1, speaking about the children of Israel. Paul says, I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. Now, he's referencing events from the book of Exodus that we looked at last year. And he's talking about how God led the children of Israel through the Red Sea, and he led them by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Verse 2, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. Now, Paul's addressing a problem that the Corinthians have, and it's a problem that we also sometimes have as well. See, the Corinthians were going to these pagan festivals, and they were going there with the mindset thinking, hey, I'm a Christian. I don't really believe in these gods anyway. I've been baptized. I regularly partake of communion. I'm a child of God. What difference does it make if I go? And when I go, what difference does it make if I participate or not? Surely I'm safe and protected, aren't I? And we sometimes think that as well, whether it has to do with the parties we attend or the music concerts we go to or whatever. We can easily think, well, I'm a Christian. I'm safe. I've been baptized. I partake of communion. I'm Lord's in my life. What difference does it make where I go and what I do when I'm there? Well, Paul wants to say, but look at the children of Israel. Could anybody have been more safe than they were? I mean, they were the people of God. He led them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, and he provided manna from heaven for them, and he took care of them, and he was with them, and they could visibly see him. But he says they weren't safe. And the evidence of that is because of their disobedience and their turning away from God. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them were disciplined by God. And Paul says, and their bodies were scattered around the wilderness. We have to understand that we have to think about where we go and what we do, and that these things do matter. And if we take the attitude of, but I went to church on Sunday, therefore I'm free to do whatever I want the rest of the week, that's simply not the case. Paul continues, verse 6. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Now, what did they do? Verse 7, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. Now, he's going to go on to list 3 other things that the children of Israel did, that the church in Corinth are in danger of doing as well. But this one, idolatry, is the most important one. You can see in verse 14, when Paul summarizes it all, he says, flee from idolatry. It's also the only one of the 4 in which Paul quotes a specific text from the Old Testament. And that tells us the issue he's dealing with the Corinthians as they're going to these pagan festivals and eating the meat that's been sacrificed to idols is the issue of idolatry. Now, when you examine what Paul is doing in arguing from the Old Testament, something fascinating arises. And the fascinating thing is to notice which verse Paul actually quotes from the Old Testament and which one he chooses not to quote. Now, in order to show this to you, let me put the text up from Exodus chapter 32. He's referencing the greatest or the worst incident of idolatry in Israel's history. This is the sin with the golden calf. Again, we studied this in the book of Exodus. Israel, which had been rescued from Egypt by God's hand, had been given the 10 commandments. While Moses was up on the mountain of God, decided they didn't want to wait anymore. So they came to Aaron and said, build us a golden calf. And verse 4 describes what happened. It says, he, Aaron, took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Now, in verse 6, it says this: "So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry." Now, if I was giving a sermon on idolatry and I wanted to talk about idolatry from Exodus 32, the phrase I would have quoted is the first phrase of chapter 6, where it says, "So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings." That's where they're actually being idolatrous. That's where they're actually bowing down and worshiping. That's where they're actually bringing offerings to this golden calf. But notice in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 10, that's not the phrase Paul quotes. Now, he's got it in front of him. Certainly, he had to read through it to get to the phrase he quotes. And the one he quotes is the second phrase. He says, "Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry." And the passage that he's quoting is not the explicit statement of their idolatry, but instead he is referencing the subsequent celebration that went with that act of idolatry. He's talking about the after party, not the actual bowing down and sacrificing. You see, in the city of Corinth, the Corinthian Christians were not going and actually worshiping idols. They knew better than that. They knew better than to show up in a pagan temple and to offer sacrifice and bow down and worship some false god. But what they were doing is they were going to the after parties. They were showing up at the celebrations after and eating the meat sacrificed to idols. And Paul's point is that idolatry takes multiple forms. It is possible to have blatant idolatry where you physically bow down in front of an idol and present offerings. But there's another very real kind of idolatry, and that's to engage in the revelry and the partying associated with idolatry. And here Paul is going to bring out a very, very important principle for us. Let me share it with you, and then I'll explain what it means and where it comes from. And this is the principle that's driving his theology. Participation in a celebration makes you a partner with the thing being celebrated. Let me say that again. Participation in a celebration makes you a partner with the thing being celebrated. In other words, context does matter. It does matter where you and I do what we do. Let me give you an illustration that might help make this a little clearer. Imagine that after church today, you decide to go for lunch to Panera Bread. And after you get done ordering your entree at Panera Bread, you have a choice. You can either have bread with that or an apple or something else. Now, question, is there anything morally better about choosing bread or choosing an apple? Is one of those morally good and the other morally wrong? It's not a trick question. No, it's just a choice. So let's just imagine that you choose the bread. Now it's time for you to pick what you want to drink. And imagine that you have a choice between grape juice and orange juice. Is there anything morally superior in choosing grape juice or choosing orange juice? No, thank you. So let's just imagine you choose the grape juice. So with your meal, you're now eating bread and drinking grape juice instead of having an apple and drinking orange juice. Now imagine that you're no longer at Panera Bread. Imagine instead that you are handed bread and grape juice and you're in the middle of a church and there's a communion celebration going on. Is the bread and the grape juice in that situation still morally neutral? Or is it now something positive? Is it actually better than an apple and orange juice? Why is it better? Is it different kind of bread or different kind of juice? It's the context. Same bread, same juice, but the context has changed. At Panera, when you eat bread and drink grape juice, you're simply a customer, and you're participating with Panera as their customer. When we come here, and there is a celebration of Jesus, and we eat bread and drink grape juice, we are becoming a participant and a partner with Jesus. Amen. That's Paul's point. That's right. Participation in the celebration makes you a partner with the thing celebrated. Look at how he says it in verse 15. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? He's talking about communion, the bread and the drink. Because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one loaf. Consider the people of Israel. Do not those who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar? Do I mean that a sacrifice offered to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. See, Paul's point is, you want to eat meat sacrificed to idols in the context of your own home? Great, go ahead. All meat's from God anyway. Enjoy it. You want to eat meat sacrificed to idols in the midst of a pagan worship service to that idol? Don't do it. Why? Because context matters. And when you eat that meat sacrificed to idols in the midst of a celebration, you become a partner with the thing that stands behind the celebration. Now, the Corinthians were saying, but there is no such thing as an idol. There is no false gods. There's only one true God. Paul says that's absolutely right. But that's not the end of the story. There may not be false gods, but there are demons. And the things that was animating the celebrations at these pagan festivals was certainly not God. And who was being honored at these pagan festivals was also not God. And Paul's saying what stands behind those celebrations is demonic activity. And when the Corinthians went and participated, yes, they didn't bow down and worship the idol. Yes, they didn't make any sacrifices. But when they go and fully engage, they're becoming partners with what stands behind the celebration. And Paul says you're becoming partners with demons. Now, what about us? Let's think back to those two hypothetical questions I asked you at the beginning of the sermon. Is there a difference between having a drink of alcohol with a family member at a meal and drinking at a fraternity party? Is there a difference? Yes. Context matters. When you are in the midst of a raucous party, what's animating that celebration is not God. And the activities that are going on at that place are not honoring to God. And Paul's saying if you and I become too much of a participant in what's happening, we become partners with the spirits that are animating that party. And so his point is that context does matter. So now, as a quick aside, we've said a lot about social drinking over these past weeks on 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. Let me just summarize quickly what Paul is saying so we can get a gist for how this works in our lives today using the issue of alcohol as example. 1 Corinthians 8. Do not cause a weaker brother to stumble. Paul is saying if you're a youth worker, should you participate in social drinking? And his answer is probably not. 1 Corinthians 9. If a non-Christian comes over to your house and brings a bottle of wine, should you drink it? Probably. 1 Corinthians 10. If you're at a fraternity party or a raucous celebration and alcohol is being served, should you drink it? Probably not. What he's saying is the context matters for these amoral decisions of life. Now, what about attending a secular music concert? Now, some of the things that happen at some of the secular music concerts are certainly not honoring to God. And the kind of frenzied hysteria that can take place is not worship being offered to God. It's being animated by forces of darkness. Now, I'm not talking about simply attending. There's a difference between attending and participating. What Paul's saying is if you're attending to try to build relationships with people so you can share the gospel with people, that's different. That's 1 Corinthians 9. He says, but if you go and you fully engage in the hysteria and the craziness, you are becoming partners with the forces of darkness that stand behind that celebration. Now, why aren't we to do those things? Verses 21 and 22. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Are we stronger than he? What Paul is saying is when you and I fully engage in this revelry and these celebrations and these group events, we cause God to be jealous. Let me give you an illustration. Imagine that you and I and Jesus are going to attend a secular music concert together. And imagine that as we're walking towards the concert, we're thanking Jesus for how amazing he's been in our life and just can't believe that he died on the cross for us and he's been raised from the dead, and we're just so grateful that he's made us alive in him. And then we head into the concert arena. And while we're sitting there, the music starts and there is mass hysteria, and we join in and we're crying and cheering and screaming, and part of the wild, raucous celebration that's happening at that music concert. What do you think Jesus is thinking while he's sitting there watching us? Would he not be jealous? Would he not say, but I died for you. What did this band ever do? What have they done for you? Now, if you simply attend with Jesus to enjoy the beauty of created music, if you attend with Jesus to try to reach those who are there who are lost, and you're simply attending, that's a different issue. But if you and I go and we fully participate, Jesus sees that as partnership with the spirits that stand behind that celebration. And it pains his heart. It makes him jealous. And so Paul is saying to us, beware of idolatry. It's not simply when you and I bow down before some statue. When we engage in celebrations and group activities and fully participate, we can make God jealous, and it's a form of idolatry. Now, Paul's warning in 1 Corinthians 10 is a warning, and so it has the feeling of being a negative command. Flee from idolatry. But the great thing about the theological truth that stands behind that command is that it was originally instituted for something positive. You see, while we can go to a party or a concert and cause God to become jealous, it's also true that when we come to the Lord's table, as we participate in this celebration, we can be partners with Jesus. Amen. That this is not just eating bread and drinking juice as if we went to Panera or we did it at home. This is something different. And that when we do this, we draw near to Jesus. And instead of making him jealous, we make his heart glad. And he joins with us in the celebration. And instead of it being about some rock band or something else, it's about him. And he's lifted up. And our spirits are soar with him. And our hearts are bound together. That's the power of the theology behind this. In just a minute, we're going to partake of the Lord's Supper. We're going to be able to see that in this context, as Jesus is being celebrated, when we eat this bread and drink this cup, we're becoming partners with him in declaring his lordship to the world. So let me invite you, if you're here this morning and you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, participate with us. If you're not, simply be an attender, not participating. In the same way, when we go to events in which Christ is not being honored, we simply want to attend and not participate. So my urge to you is, if you've not yet agreed to make Christ the Lord of your life, please don't participate. But if he is Lord of your life, as the elements are passed, take a piece of bread and take a cup, hold on to them. We will partake of them together so that we might all be participants in the celebration. We're going to have a moment of silent reflection. During that time, I would ask, I'm thinking myself about these things. What are ways that we have made Jesus jealous in the past week, the past month, the past year, through the kinds of things we participated in? Have we been so engaged, whether it's in music or in sports or in partying or whatever it is, and not given that same level of engagement to Jesus that we've caused him to be jealous? Let's confess that. And then what we're going to try to do during the time in which we are holding the bread and the cup is we're going to sing songs that are more celebratory. And we want to have an opportunity to celebrate Jesus and to become partners with him in that celebration.